All right, Steve, take it away.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and I see a lot of the usual suspects here, and as well as some names that look new to me. So welcome to the newcomers in particular. So I'm going to do a little 5-minute introduction, and then we'll toss it open for discussion. So our topic for today is positive evolutionary psychology. So I wanted to start by briefly defining what that field is and what type of questions it asks, and then opening it up for discussion. So Cosmides and Tooby said back in 1997 that EvPsych is not an area of study within psychology as much as it's a way of thinking about psychology that can be applied to any topic within it. And so EvPsych is like a lens that we can use to look at any aspect of human behavior, which is essentially what we do in Examine Lives. And that lens can be used to examine what conditions are conducive to happiness and life satisfaction, which are the central concerns of positive psychology, a well-established field of research which studies the factors that increase such positive life outcomes. So positive evolutionary psychology is kind of an intellectual marriage, if you will, between those two fields. It's both integrative, and it's really an applied discipline in that it attempts to use insights from both evolutionary and positive psychology to provide guidance for human flourishing. The leading figure in the field is Geher, who is at SUNY Binghamton. And he defines he defines positive evolutionary psychology as, quote, the use of evolutionary principles to help people and communities experience more positive and fulfilling lives. So the question for today is, what can evolutionary psychology tell us about how to live a happy and satisfied life? Now, there's some irony in this question, because in one sense, at least, evolution doesn't give a fig about whether we're happy or satisfied at all, because all it cares about is whether our genes get replicated. So stated more academically, happiness is a proximate goal, not an ultimate goal. That is, if we were to quickly generate a list of things that make people happy, we very quickly might come up with food, sex, friendship, and maybe problem solving. And all of those things can readily be seen to increase our fitness. So happiness is a means to an end. It's our desire for happiness that motivates us to seek these fitness enhancing outcomes. So we can come at the question for today's discussion, I think, about how to live a happy life from two different directions. You can think about the findings of positive psychology and kind of reverse engineer it and think about whether those findings square with evolutionary science. Conversely, we can use the knowledge of evolutionary science to infer what should facilitate happiness, and then see if that is supported by research findings. One of the most obvious areas that EvPsych can inform us, I think, about happiness is the concept of evolutionary mismatch. And we did have a session on that a number of months ago. And I imagine we'll talk some about that today. But the knowledge base of evolutionary psychology can also tell us things about relationships and community and politics and attitudes to cultivate in life. So let me wrap up by sharing just a personal example. One of the things I try to do on a good day, at least, is I try to live as if I'm in a tribe of 150 people that I will encounter over and over again for the rest of my life. Now, this is not true, but if I trick myself into thinking that, what it cues me to do is be kind and civil to the strangers that I encounter. Clerks in stores, servers in restaurants, customer service reps on the phone, etc., which can make daily life much more pleasant, and more selfishly, perhaps, I think I get better service. So let me, with that introduction, open this up for discussion. And the question then is, what does evolutionary science teach us about how we can be happy? Or stating that inversely, what does it teach us about how we might set ourselves up for unhappiness? I see Diane has her hand up, so.
Right. I think it'll be great to look at both sides of that. But I'd like to ask one question at the beginning, which is, can we look at what we think the evolutionary significance of happiness itself is? In other words, what is the function of happiness?
Yep.
I would make a suggestion, which is that it tells us that in fact we are doing some of the right things. In other words, how I define happiness is this: it's a momentary signal that you're better off in some way or another than you were a little before, because happiness doesn't last.
It can mislead us, right? Because I might be really happy eating junk food, but it might not be conducive to my overall happiness.
Right, or you might be happy taking heroin, for that matter.
Okay.
Boy, did you hit home with that one.
Andy, jump in.
Oh, I've got a different question, actually. Can you clarify what evolutionary psychology is, the Tooby and Cosmides? Because when I read it, I think I read it too quickly, leapt to some conclusions, and got some negative ideas from other people. So can you clarify what evolutionary psychology is from that perspective, and how that marries with positive psychology to make positive evolutionary psychology?
Does anybody, I can do that, but would anybody else like to take a crack at an answer?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, the question was, I've probably got a complete misinterpretation of what evolutionary psychology is from a very quick reading and from secondhand sources. So can you clarify what evolutionary psychology is from the point of view from Tooby and Cosmides? And can you also indicate how that marries with positive psychology?
Again, I can venture a response, but there are other people that might be able to share their thoughts on that as well. So let me see if anybody else wants to reply. Kathleen?
As someone who's not in psychology, I want to see if I'm right, but evolutionary psychology, to the best of my understanding, is understanding psychology from an evolutionary perspective. Our behaviors, our attitudes, our perceptions, our cognition, understanding them in terms of adaptations. And positive psychology is a movement that began with people trying to focus on happiness instead of pathology and flaws. That's just to get us started.
For a non-psychologist, that's an A+ answer, Kathleen. Rob.
Oh boy. Well, I'm thinking about happiness now, and it seems to me that happy people have some advantages. They're less likely to murder other members of their unit, and they probably make better sexual partners and enhance their reproductive fitness. So I think happiness serves a pretty important function, actually.
Well, you mentioned the two biggies, survival and reproduction, in your reply. I guess one way I think about the definition that Cosmides and Tooby gave is that evolutionary psychology is trying to add an understanding of ultimate causation as well as proximal causation. So one example might be that let's take any particular behavior. Let's take sexual assault or rape as an example. Traditional psychology would try to understand why a particular individual engaged in that behavior. What was it about that person's biology or their childhood or their personality traits or whatever it might be that would lead to that action? Evolutionary psychology asks a different question, which I think is just that it's not incompatible, it's just at a different level. Evolutionary psychology asks, why is rape in the repertoire of male Homo sapiens? And that's just a different question, I think, than a proximal explanation. So that would be one way to answer that. And I think that the second question that you raised is, how does it relate to positive psychology? And I think that is really asking about that. Again, it asks about the ultimate causes for happiness. Why do the things that provide us satisfaction, why do they exist in an ultimate sense? And it must be, they're either adaptive or byproducts of an adaptation. Ruth. You're muted, Ruth.
I'm new, but this will help me get oriented. Maybe it will help someone else. Are you familiar with Matthieu Ricard, who is a Buddhist monk, was a translator of the Dalai Lama, a Ph.D. in biosciences, very interesting guy, and who's written a giant book on happiness, which boils down to, if I dare, that happiness comes from getting beyond the attachments and aversions and ignorance of everyday life, that happiness is about going beyond those immediate needs. And of course, this is the ultimate, but that there is no comparison. And so I don't know where spirituality, Buddhism, for example, comes into your discussion, but he's special. Thank you.
I'm not familiar with him or that book. What popped into my head as you said that is that it, in some ways, positive evolutionary psychology emphasizes the importance of attachment, at least in the sense of the importance of attachment to friends and to kin and to community. Basically, the research in EvPsych and positive EvPsych would suggest that for most people, isolation is not conducive to happiness. I don't necessarily know if that would be incompatible with the sort of rising above attachment of Buddhism, although I've always thought about, that nirvana is defined as the absence of desire, and yet you're supposed to desire nirvana, which always seems like a internal contradiction to me, but that's maybe a different rabbit hole.
Let me answer that rabbit hole for myself, that Buddhism is not being alone. Buddhism is seeing we are not alone at all, right?
Okay.
And that there are profound connections. And of course, there are many schools, et cetera, but I think it gets this rap of being unhappy or putting away all these good feelings. It's not against pleasure or enjoyment. It's against these attachments becoming addictions, which we're designed for. So it's an immediate evolution or whatever, proximate. It's
Okay.
getting beyond the proximate to the ultimate is what I'm hearing, but I'm new to this, so I'll be quiet.
Okay. Hank is applauding. I don't know if that's you wanted to
Oh,
say
who's
something?
applauding?
I'll
Hey,
applaud too, but yes.
yay, yay,
But
hey.
okay, I'm gonna hit you all with. It's a little provocative, but it does mean something to me, and I'll ask it in an intellectual way. What if happiness is profoundly a cultural construct, a meme, rather a gene? And because everything we do is based on a cultural construct. Our intellect, our going to school, studying, having these discussions. But I would like to sort of think about this in a more, well, what if it is primarily a cultural construct? Like you said, Steve, nature is not interested whether we're happy or not.
Mm-hmm.
So why would we have, I haven't read enough about this question, but why would evolutionary biology and psychology, why would we need happiness?
And one way to think about that
around,
would
yeah.
one way to think about that would be in terms of human universals. To what degree are there Are there features of happiness that are universal cross-culturally? That would be one way to think about your question. I think, I'm not sure whose hand up was up first, but Gavin, I just saw, Andy was up first. Okay, so Andy and then Gavin.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, well, not ask, just to respond to that previous comment as whether happiness is a cultural construct. I think to some extent for humans, yes. The question is, can other creatures like cats and dogs be happy, or at least content, if we want to go beyond what happiness means, contentment? Because I certainly know that cats can be content. They sort of like do that and purr. But I'm not sure if that's a cultural construct.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the answer, of course, may be different for different levels of sentience in different animals, perhaps. But Gavin.
Sure. So I guess I would, following the Buddhist theme that was coming up earlier, the Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the guy whose name evades me right now, wrote this book called The Book of Joy, and they talk about 8 pillars of happiness. So that's there are perspective, acceptance, humility, humor, forgiveness, compassion, generosity, and gratitude. And when you think of those things, like that list, if you're familiar with like Sonia Lyubomirsky's work or Martin Seligman's work, there's almost like perfect alignment. Like in The How of Happiness by Sonia Lyubomirsky, she almost hits every single one of those, almost using exactly the same word. So there's, super alignment between, thousands of year old religious philosophy and everything, and the field of positive psychology. And then I guess I'd say what the field of positive psychology is asking is what makes us sustainably happy, what how do we flourish, and what evolutionary psychology is really asking is why do those things influence us? Why have we and the reason for that in my mind is because we're superorganisms. So our success, our survival, and the survival of the next generation and the generation after that, et cetera, depends on the survival and continuation of our group. And if you think about all those things that I just said in the Book of Joy or the How of Happiness, those are all things that are essential for a human group. So I'll say that one more time, and then think if a group could exist without even one of these things. So, humor, humility, forgiveness, compassion, generosity, and gratitude. And I don't think if you're missing even just one of those things, I don't think a human group can survive. It certainly is not going to be optimal. And if, we're a group, wandering around the African plains 50,000 years ago, and the group is not optimally performing, it's not going to go well. So I think
Nicely
that's
put.
Essentially where, kind of, how the thing goes together.
Very, very nicely put. I would just add as a postscript to that, I did read Geher's book, Positive Evolutionary Psychology, and several of the things on that list are discussed in the book. The two that pop to mind most immediately are gratitude and forgiveness, which he talks about again in terms of the importance of social ties. And there's research on both gratitude and forgiveness that they do, in fact, enhance self-reported happiness and life satisfaction. So nice, very nice comments, Gavin. Other folks? Hank. Oh, you're just still applauding, Hank, or is there a hand up?
It's the only thing I have there that looks reasonable.
Okay.
Should I put a thumbs up? Yeah.
Let's go back to Hank's question. I'm not sure to what degree is happiness different in different cultures, perhaps, is a way to ask Hank's question.
But I wanted to ask you a little differently this time.
Sure.
In terms of, I need help with exactly what it means, but evolutionary fitness to stay alive, to survive, and reproduce. Okay, that's how I understand it. So maybe, I forget who said this, but maybe happiness can be changed to contentment. but how is contentment or happiness, how is that manifest to keep the race alive, to stay alive, propagate long enough, stay alive long enough to have babies and take care of them, and you get set out on a glacier and the next group comes around and they go on the glacier. But I'm not sure from this evolutionary perspective, we need contentment or happiness. I'm not saying I don't want it. And I
Sure.
think about it clinically, what people say make them unhappy. I'm working with a young fellow in his 40s. That's young to me. And he's unhappy because he can't, he has a inspiration inhibition, I call it. He can't feel motivated to know what he wants at 47. Even though he's got a decent job, he's got some university stuff, he plays music, he has trouble with stuff with women and things like that. But for him, it's like he's missing motivation or inspiration. I just want to bring it up, not to get into the
Well,
situation.
that comment makes me think of one of the readings that I listed for today was a book review of Geher's book. And the author of that book review says that one of the things he thinks is missing in positive evolutionary psychology is the role of meaning, feeling that your life has meaning. That I think is a good comment. I'd like to go in order here, and you're going to have to help me with the correct pronunciation of your name. Yeah, out in Portland, Oregon. So
Jay.
Jay.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this question of is happiness cultural? And what you just said actually is touching on something I wanted to bring up, because there's sort of a few different understandings of happiness, right? So one, and there's also two ways of looking at it. So there's one which is kind of the affect based, like feeling states in the moment, which is think about like hedonism or eudaimonia, which is like well-being. But then there's kind of the life satisfaction question of happiness, of like looking through the totality of one's life, whether or not there's happiness there. And so they're different answers, I think, to different questions. And I think the life satisfaction one seems clearly to be like more cultural, because throughout, the course of your life, like what you determine, like how you look at your overall circumstances and how you respond to those things in a lot of ways is very cultural. But then we can look at hedonism versus eudaimonia. And hedonism is sort of more, I would say, I guess, in line with what we might consider to be like more animalistic understandings of happiness, like my needs are being met. And, there's the hedonic treadmill, which over time, having our needs met a lot kind of loses its flavor, right? It doesn't make us happy anymore. And I think when I think about like the evolutionary reasoning for that, and not being I'm an expert in philosophy, but not in the evolutionary science aspect of it. But I think that would serve, because in nature, having too much of one thing can be damaging. And we see that all the time. Like if you eat a lot of one food, you actually could become allergic to it. Like that's literally what happened to me. And so we're not supposed to be eating a lot of one thing or taking a lot of one thing. And so encouraging us to have diversified sources of food and that kind of thing. I think that's kind of speaks to the evolutionary purpose of hedonism, but thinking about the evolutionary purpose of eudaimonia and, these ideas of meaningful states and meaningful emotional states, that also feels a little bit cultural. But I think it also speaks to the evolutionary need for like belonging and for having a tribe and for social connection and for care and those sorts of things. So yeah. I just, I think I'm repeating a lot of what has already been said, but.
Can you define that term for those of us that haven't heard it before, eudaimonia? What is the definition of that word?
Yeah, I mean, eudaimonia is, I would define it as a happiness that comes from meaning, pretty much from having meaningful states, meaningful interactions, or just meaningful emotions, as opposed to happiness that's just more focused on food and basic needs and sex, maybe, and just more of those biological kind of urges.
And you might be interested to know that the founder of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, wrote a book called Authentic Happiness. in which he talks about different types of happiness, and the one that he refers to as authentic happiness is the one that relates to a sense of meaning. So you might find that might be a book that might be of interest. Bob.
Thanks.
Hi there. So much of this discussion about these positive psychological aspects remind me of what David Sloan Wilson called practical reality, or Brett Weinstein called metaphorical truth. Just any beneficial belief that, whether it's true or not, if it inspires you to take actions that are beneficial to you and your clan, your band, that can be adaptive. And I could just, it builds a little bit on the discussion that Jay just led, that creating meaning, or all this comes about in days when we struggled so much to attain these things. So all these positive psychological reinforcements or inspirations for us to pursue the things that were beneficial to us, whereas today we're mismatched and they come so easily. So happiness, or so many of these positive things, including meaning, seem so ephemeral because they come too easily, and that's not how we evolved. Thanks.
Kathleen.
Maybe this is obvious, but I don't think meaning is anything that we can conceptualize outside of a human group. There's nothing in evolution meaning is being meaningful to someone or something. There's no inherent meaning in something.
Okay. Gavin.
I would just, as far as like meaning goes, and so like meaning and purpose and everything comes up often. So I'm involved in conscious capitalism, and when we talk about purpose, we define it as the thing that you are really good at, that you're passionate about, and that your group needs. So, and your purpose is sort of in there. And if you think of it from an evolutionary biology point of view, the thing that you're good at is probably likely to be the thing that you are, something that you're also passionate about, and whatever it is that your group needs, that's the thing that should be motivating you to do something. So like we all know people who love fishing, right? So people just, they're extremely excited about going out and going fishing, and that's a good thing to do for their group. They're just super excited to do that. So it's sort of like their purpose is they're a fisher person or whatever, that's what they do. But so that meaning or purpose thing, I think, comes a lot from belonging and being part of a group and seeing what your group needs and knowing what it is that you're good at, and then being able to do something that comes together with that.
Thanks, Gavin. Hank.
Gavin, I like what you said about the whole notion of what the group needs, so the group can protect us, survive us, nurture, help us survive. So I'm thinking about, I'd say I'll be a little political, but let's say the group that sort of attaches to Mr. Trump. Let's say my definition, I think of Eric Fromm. He talks about, just give me a second, biophilia and necrophilia. Biophilia is the lover of life. Necrophilia is the lover of destruction. So that's Eric Fromm's work. And so what if my group loves destruction, and I'm content and I'm happy and I'm satisfied and I'm bonded with my little group and my family and Fox 5, whatever it is. How does that work in terms of evolutionary fitness? If we're talking about, I'm not sure I like positive psychology or any of that, but what keeps the group together, as Gavin was saying? And is it happiness, or is it sort of, I feel safe because I'm in a group, and that the reptilian brain or that ancient brain that you talked about, Steve, is that what's getting satisfied rather than happiness?
Again, I'll go to Diane in 1 second. I would say that my sense of this is that what positive evolutionary psychology would say is that happiness is what results when we do things that are adaptive for us.
Oh,
Yeah, Diane?
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to what Hank was saying, and it's perfectly compatible with what you just said, which is we always have to remember the two-level or multi-level selection business, because what's good for your group in some way is going to be good for you, of course, and so you will find meaning there. But the conflict between your group and somebody else's group may be very destructive. And it seems to me that one of the challenges, and I noticed that one of the options is to talk about war next week. So it would come to that. When there's war, people become very close and solidary in their group. But then all these terrible things happen to people in both groups, usually. So it's more complicated than just a person getting to be happy. It's always in this incredibly complex social context.
That's really a perceptive comment, Diane. It makes me basically translate that into thinking about tribalism and you know, feeling part of a tribe, feeling part of a group in one sense increases happiness, but in another sense it may create you know, intergroup conflict, which may decrease happiness to some degree, particularly if you're not the group that prevails in whatever that conflict is. Again, I don't know whose hand was up first, but I'll go to Jay and then Gavin.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said was kind of speaking to what I was going to say. So there's this concept I mentioned in the chat of necropolitics. This philosopher, his name's Achille Mbembe. I can put it in the chat. So he describes it as like this capacity to define who does matter and who doesn't, and who's disposable and who isn't. So it's like a framework that really, it's a framework where like political entities assign differential value to human life, right? So the closer to power you are, the more your life is worth. And I think it's kind of fair to say that does describe the US in a lot of ways right now. And so I think that really speaks to like tribalism, as you said. So it's people that are as a protective mechanism for their own social group, hoarding power and resources and determining that, people outside of that group are kind of like collateral damage. And so for them, the happiness is centered around themselves and their family groups and their cultural groups. And, they're willing to sacrifice, the happiness of others at scale. But I wanted to mention that real quick, but I actually raised my hand because I wanted to talk about this idea of like memetics, right? So thinking about meaning does seem like this like uniquely human thing, but when you think about memetics, and I think Richard Dawkins talked about this, about how memes are sort of cultural, or they're tiny almost like atoms, like units of cultural meaning, of cultural evolution, and they can and they act in a lot of ways like cells and how they divide and reproduce. So there's sort of these cultural replicators that act like DNA that pass along meaningful information from one person to the next, from one generation to the next, from one culture to the next, And so I think that's just an interesting kind of thing to throw in there of like, what if the hedonic, clearly the hedonic is something that's sort of more genetic, right? This is like kind of programmed in us in order to get our basic needs met. And that is something that animals have as well. The eudaimonic one, if we can say that's more analogous to memes, and memes and genes are kind of analogous to each other, then yeah, it's interesting just to like for me to ask that question of like, okay, maybe maybe it does divide and reproduce in a similar way in order to pass along valuable cultural information that creates that, that tribalism, that sense of connection and bonding and belonging, as opposed to the more biological version. But in a way, it's analogous, it's parallel, and it's acting similarly. And I think that kind of speaks to this other idea of like how humanity likes to think of itself as separate from nature, but in fact, we are within nature, and that, a lot of these things that are problems in the world right now are because we have seen ourselves as separate from nature and don't apply to nature's law. But in fact, everything kind of applies to nature's law, even how we understand meaning. So
thank you. Of course, when you talk about memetics, you're talking about cultural evolution. We had a session of Examine Lives recently on dual inheritance theory, which really is talking about both genetic and cultural evolution. And I'm still kind of stuck back. I'm not sure we've really directly addressed Hank's question about how much of happiness is sort of nature and how much is nurture. And it occurs to me the answer might be that it's both. So, for example, my hunch is that if we look cross-culturally, we would find that friendships are an important part of happiness for almost everywhere, given the social nature of all of us as primates. But resource acquisition or wealth might vary from culture to culture in terms of how much of a role that plays in happiness. And there may be other examples we could think. And it may be that for all of those, there's we want to think in terms of dual inheritance theory, there's an influence of both. The relative weight of each might be different for different aspects of happiness. I think, Gavin, did you have your hand up again for a second?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Andy, go ahead.
Okay, going back to positive evolutionary psychology. We're talking very much about the background and the theory here. For you as a psychotherapist, psychiatrist, clinicians, what does it mean in terms of downstream helping people who want to be better? Therapy or self-help, really?
That would be a whole nother conversation. I think. I mean, one way to think about that from some of the readings I've done in what's called evolutionary clinical psychology or evolutionary clinical psychiatry, which really is much more at this stage. It's a very young science, and it talks mostly about theoretical explanations for different disorders. It doesn't translate very well into a toolkit of therapeutic interventions. It's more a way of understanding. And one thing I think that I took from that literature that's useful is we can think about humans having biosocial goals. And the term biosocial means that any goals that humans have, because we're primates, are a kind of a combination of biology and social, because any of our biological goals require us to be part of a social group. And one way to think about unhappiness, and to some degree even psychopathology, is when biosocial goals are frustrated, when people are unable to implement biosocial goals. And so thinking about what are the impediments and obstacles that are preventing somebody from a particular biosocial goal, excuse me, which, for example, might be, to put this in ev-psych terms, finding a mate and mating, and what are the obstacles that are preventing that. Failure in that biosocial goal, just to use that example, a failure in mating is well known to create a lot of emotional distress in people. So that would be one off the top of my head reaction, Andy. I don't know how helpful that is. David.
I was interested.
Oh, go ahead, Andy, and then David.
Yeah, the practicality when you opened up saying, like, it helps me to realize I'm part of a tribe of about 150 people. So you are looking at the, well, going Paleolithic mind, really, aren't you? In a modern setting.
Yes. Yeah. David.
Okay, there, I unmuted. I think you can hear me, right?
We can, David.
Oh, good, thanks. You can't see me because, anyway, I have problems with the camera on this computer. But so I apologize for that. What strikes me here is that there's a lot of talk about happiness. I'd like to understand, or I'd like to see some explanation or some relationship building between well-being and happiness, because I don't think you can achieve happiness without well-being. And I think this does go a little bit back to what Jay was saying about oneness and about wholeness, but really our well-being affects the psychology of the tribe, right? And the sense of the tribe. And if we're under threat constantly from other tribes, then how do we ever resolve that? And so that's the process of community building, right? That's the process of building communities that seek well-being, the good of all, rather than the exploitation of others. So anyway, I put it out there as, I don't know, I think well-being is more at the core than happiness. Happiness is as a result of well-being.
Can you, David, could you just define the difference between the two terms as you're using them a little bit further?
You mean happiness and well-being?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So happiness is really a state of, well, I suppose it could be a social state, a happy tribe. But well-being is the health, the whole health of the individual. So that includes their psychology, but also the environment in which they live.
Okay.
It's not just a happiness that comes from, for example, in our society today, we're quite unhappy. Although we probably have, at least in America, we have greater well-being than any generation prior to this, just in terms of gross economic product and so on and so forth. But we don't feel good.
One point you make, David,
sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful. One point you made that I hadn't thought about, but I think it's really an interesting one, is that to some degree, happiness is going to be contingent on the degree of external threat. If there's a lot of threats either to your group or to you as an individual, common sense would say to me, it's going to be harder to be happy if I feel under a lot of threats. And whether we contemporary Americans have more threats than people in the past, I'm not sure about that, but I do think that the level of external threat might relate to reported life happiness, I guess. Rob and then Hank.
I've read a lot of studies about happiness in various countries, and the U.S. does not rank very high in those studies. Child mortality, maternal mortality, the number of opioid suicides. There are lots of measures, educational achievement, it's all going down. I don't see the United States as being in a very good space in terms of either
Do you know who tops those country rankings typically? Finland.
Yeah.
And which has always been a puzzle to me, because at the same time, it always comes out the highest in reported life satisfaction. They also have one of the highest rates of alcoholism and suicide anywhere. So it's a puzzling mix to me. Hank and then Diane.
Okay.
Yeah, so much is going on, but let's see if I can go back to happiness. And I think somebody mentioned it as a social construct. I forget, I don't know if it was David or But if we think about this tribal stuff, that what makes you happy or gives you meaning is you feel safe and you have a tribe to feel known in or just protected or have a role or have a place. So I don't know if that's happiness or it's satisfaction or just, I'm so glad I'm not going to die, would be one definition of happiness. It could be relief and excitement. I've got a future. So I'm just trying to come up with thoughts about happiness, but in terms of evolutionary fitness. And if it's to belong to a tribe, and if you mess up in the tribe, you're dead. They kick you out, they shun you. And so I'm just thinking of an example. I had a client come in, a guy in his late 30s, very successful guy. He wanted to be married, not because he was in love or he was excited. He just wanted to fit in. He wanted to be married and have a kid and be a partner in a law firm and whatever it is, have a nice apartment. So there's just one little example of, I don't know if he was happy. I would say not, based upon being around in the room with him, but he was not happy, but he had everything he wanted, lots of money.
Yeah.
So just a little simple example, not a larger group thing, but he wanted to fit in so badly for whatever evolutionary reason.
I believe some of the research in positive psychology singles out as the single most important factor in reported life satisfaction and happiness, friendships. Friendships really rises to the top in many, many studies as to it's just key. And I don't know the literature well enough, but my guess is that's probably a cultural universal.
So. Look, Steve, there was I remember doing a talk years ago. I think it was a quote from Cicero. It says about friendship. It was, if it goes well, friendship doubles the joy and halves the sorrow.
That's very
but
nice.
I think we're reaching for friendship. I just want to belong so I don't die, so I can have babies.
All right.
I mean, if we stay at the most basic survival mechanism, I'm not arguing that. Yeah, I'd like to just stay with that as a core motivation as opposed to positive psychology. You know, I'm going to live another day.
Diane, and then I see Sage is signing back on, so I don't know if he's going to want us to wrap up the discussion and do a vote, but go ahead, Diane. Diane and Kathleen and Gavin, and then Sage, and that probably will be it.
Okay. I just wanted to remark on this material well-being versus more holistic well-being. A lot depends on the structure of the group and the amount of inequality. And so we know that among the industrialized societies where there's quite a lot of material well-being, so to speak, the more unequal the society is, the more you're going to see things like mental health, obesity, suicide, depression, all kinds of socially related ills. So it's not just a matter of the individual. It's also a matter of the health and the well-being of the social surround.
You could argue that income inequality is an evolutionary mismatch, because in the environment of evolutionary, right, in the environment of evolutionary adaptation, hunter-gatherer tribes are notably egalitarian, and so the fact that we're living in non-egalitarian societies is in fact an evolutionary mismatch.
That's a wonderful point.
Kathleen?
Diane said a lot of what I wanted to express, but I think also, you know, there's a mistake today. A lot of people think that when we want to reduce inequality, we're looking for equality of outcomes. That is not at all what an egalitarian society is about. An egalitarian society is about making sure everybody feels they matter. You know, they might not be as successful in one or another thing, But there's a way that's found for them to participate and feel meaningful. And that's not, and I just wanted to say another thing is I just read this book called Humankind. So maybe this is not news to a lot of people, but I was astounded at how many of the major well-known experiments of the 20th century turned out to be, I can't think of the word in English right now, truqué, you would say in French, like they were flawed. You know, every experiment major showing that people are inherently bad in various ways, somebody does the research and finds that they were, I can't think of the word.
What you're referring to, I think, is
manufactured.
It's been, I think what you're referring to has been referred to as the replication crisis in the social sciences.
But these are major findings
Yes.
that everybody believes. And I just want to say it made me a lot happier reading that they were dismantled. And speaking of memes, boy, those are powerful memes. You want to make people unhappy, just convince them that friendship is impossible, that we're really selfish and all the rest of it.
Good point. Gavin?
Sure. So I just, to Hank's, I think where Hank's trying to get at is, okay, so this happiness thing and yeah, it helps us to survive. But I guess I would also sort of say that, the better, the more highly functional a human group is, the happier the people in that group will tend to be. So, so it's not just a pass fail kind of thing. And when we find a group that is super highly functional, we can tell right away. There's, minimal hierarchy, maximum autonomy. People are strong sense of belonging, competence in the group. People have a sense of purpose and what they're all about. And when we see that, then we become, really excited to be part of that, of that kind of group, and our happiness level goes way up. And I think, incrementally along the way, we may be in a group that's sort of mediocre and it starts to do a little bit better. We may have this surge because, and then we kind of reset back down to our hedonic, adaptation level or whatever. But, as we go along, we can actually, move from the, more of an Eeyore, state to more of a Tigger state, as a group, as that group, does better and better all the time.
Thank you. Sage, back to you.
Okay, so we're at a three-way tie for the three topics, but we've only had 8 people do it. So let's just take 1 minute. For those who haven't, click that link, take a gander over the suggestions and choose 1 or 2 of your favorite.
Well, people are doing that. Gavin, I think you made a really important point, maybe just to remind ourselves that happiness is not an all or nothing thing. It's a continuum. It's not either that you're happy or unhappy. And also you may be happy about some aspects of your life and unhappy about others. So it's a complicated construct, not just a black and white 2 buckets and you're in one or the other. Yeah. Hank?
Yeah, I just want to say that I am not satisfied that happiness is just, I'm glad I'm alive and I can go on another day and procreate and raise a child and do my job. But I'm saying maybe that's an important construct to keep in mind as a kind of a baseline for thinking about whether it's positive psychology or happiness that's culturally informed. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not a cynic,
Yeah. We know you're not a cynic, Hank.
Okay.
Don't worry. It makes me think a little bit about the research on income and happiness, which finds that income does affect happiness up until a certain threshold, right. And then after that, it has very little impact on it. So that's similar to what you're saying, is that we have to have some baseline needs met, and then after that, other variables come into play to affect happiness.
I guess, Steve, I'll just add that so much about this, I need to belong, and that will give me a chance to live longer and maybe accomplish some things and make meaning that's accepted by the tribe. So I still go back to the fitness is within the tribe.
Mhm.
which determines, if we're a bunch of haters, we're going to do great. If we're a bunch of Buddha, where we we operate on a transpersonal level, it's good to be around the people. But it's something about being connected, not just attachment theory, but the bigger picture, being in the same unit. Whether I just want to say, Steve, your comment was, I live in a building of about 350 apartments or something like that here in Manhattan. And I'm going to keep that in mind as I deal with everybody who's in the elevator at board meetings.
Yes.
I needed some help on that one.
Well, I did say that I'm only able to adopt that attitude on a good day. So
That's right. Yeah.
so, okay, Sage.
All right, thanks for those who jumped in. We are set for an exploration of the execution hypothesis for the evolution of a morality of fairness. I had not heard of this as a part 2 around reverse dominance. So this is will be new to me. And in second place, we had the evolutionary psychology of war, but neuroplasticity was also popular. So I'm sure we'll see these pop up. But for now, that's where we'll go for next session. Thanks, Steve, for hosting and for everybody's wonderful contributions. Wonderful to see some new faces here as well. And you can join us on Hilo to keep the conversation going. And otherwise, we'll see you next month.
Okay.
Thank you again, Steve.
I hope everybody was happy with how this went today.
I'm going to live another day.
That's a low bar, Hank, but thank you.
Maybe content.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.